And it's book club time. Oh man, thanks for being here. I'm so excited to get started. This week we are doing Addicted to Love by Jan Geurtz. This book so far has been a lot interesting, also not interesting, good, also not so good, bit boring, bit repetitive, but also kind of insightful. And I think since this is our September book club pick, we're going to go through part one. It is 2 parts. So this video is just going to be part one. We're going to go through reflections. We're going to go through thoughts and just quick chapter summaries of each. So let's dive right in. Chapter 1 is the mother of all misunderstandings. This chapter basically opens up on this mistaken belief that we carry that we are not okay. So what he has basically said in the first chapter is that we inherently have this thing called the negative belief. And he says it forms in childhood, and that we basically, any moment that we felt unseen, unloved, unheard, and we didn't experience the unconditionalness of our parents' love, our friends' loves, anyone's love really, we didn't view it as the limitation of the person who was giving us this experience. We viewed it as that we were not okay as we were. So this belief, this negative self-belief develops. So he basically says that it doesn't stay conscious. It basically gets absorbed by us. And once we absorb it, it sinks below our awareness. So basically it becomes unconscious. And he also then says it continues to shape our identity. So that's an important part that he kind of starts off with. And he shapes most of the book around this concept of what is our identity. Now, one thing to contextualize in this beginning chapter is that he does, although not clearly, he is talking about developmental psychology, and that mirrors a lot about attachment theory. So the thing that he calls these unconscious models that are running loops in our minds, they are actually, kind of models of psychology. He does universalize it. So this is the key thing that he brings out throughout this whole part 1 is this universal thing of that we believe we are lacking, and everything, our entire identity comes from this negative self-worth, negative belief about ourselves. And from here, he really starts to unpack chapter by chapter. So as he's now said in the first chapter is that the first layer of identity is our negative belief. And what that basically means is that we interpret every experience from this negative belief. Like, I am not enough, I am not good enough, and because we carry these I'm not enough, I'm not worthy enough, basically, this means that every single experience we have either rejects the claim or confirms it. If it confirms it, we then believe, yes, we are not good enough. And if there is then an experience that rejects that claim, we kind of reject that too, because we then go back to still believing we're not good enough. So he's basically saying that the negative belief will either confirm every situation we're in or silence when it's not. So basically he uses one of the examples of, imagine that someone cancels dinner plans with you, right? One person will get like, no, it doesn't really matter, it's fine, no problem. Another person will take that as confirmation that they're not worth spending time with, right? And they're not worth the time. So this lack of negative self-belief gets reinforced again. In psychology, if we had to really look at what he's claiming through this, is it's very similar to how in CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, I forgot that for a second, that's what in CBT we refer to as our core beliefs. So what makes up our core belief? And these core beliefs are these unconscious attempts to basically interpret or distort our experience of events. Geurtz is using it in a very spiritually kind of way, but not really. So it's good to have that context of what are the kind of psychology around that, because he is really talking about the identity. In chapter 3, he goes into what lives on top of the negative belief, right? So he says that we have these basic coping strategies. Now, the coping strategies are our basic rules. So basically, our unconscious formulas. If I achieve enough, I will be loved. If I do this, I will gain this reward. Basically, it's how do we have these rules around our identity? A way to protect ourselves and engage in the world and kind of remove ourselves from this concept that he keeps repeating, which is self-rejection. Now, the problem is these rules are very rigid. They kind of keep us stuck in that, right? So if we don't really they don't really help us to adapt to different situations, right? And you can imagine that having strict rules around events and our self-worth is now tied up with that. It's a very rigid way to live. He also notes that these rules are all based in fear. So if you live one way, you'll gain this acceptance, but the acceptance doesn't last very long, which he goes into a different chapter. But he's also talking about how if, for example, you're a people pleaser, you may say yes to someone even though you want to say no because it's short-term relief of this rejection. But in the long term, you feel this resentment because you know that you're doing something you don't really want to do. And that builds again to this self-rejecting negative belief. So you're building on the negative belief, what he's saying. If we look at this in psychological terms and like psychological theory, it parallels this thing called the schema theory. And schemas are basically rules that we use to cope within real life. But they do tend to unconsciously trap us in these repetitive cycles. So you tend to choose the same people based on certain traits because they bring you specific, not necessarily a reward or safety, but possibly you're with someone that has similar traits to how you were with someone the last time. So if you let these kind of schemas go unconsciously, you tend to structure your life around it. And I suppose that's what his book's about, right? Is that these parts of our identities we search for in other people. So that's a good thing to note. This is a big thing because we have conditioned responses to things. So basically, once we establish the schema or this habitual practice, this conditioned response, we behave according to it. So these old fears, these old behaviors that we've kind of ingrained in, and as Geurtz is saying, is it kind of gets into these negative belief patterns, we choose people and situations that trigger this habitual pattern, even if it's bad. And he is advocating for the fact that everything that we're choosing is reinforcing this negative belief. So we are in fact consistently going towards and creating our own suffering, which is one of the chapters he then goes on to further on. So now the final chapter in terms of the final layer of our identity is the image. So the image is the self that we present to the world. This is the mask designed whether to win approval or to kind of hide our negative beliefs, basically. And it kind of takes many forms. And he goes into a few examples of like the confident achiever or the caregiver or the tough loner. Like he creates these self-images of who these people are and who you can be and what they come up as. These self-images aren't actually true and they're not solid. So at any point in time, behavior and external sources can kind of reinforce an existing mask that you have on, or they crack the mask and then that negative self-belief comes in. So you see, he keeps repeating this concept of what the identity is and the layers of the identity. What this chapter refers to a lot and what's very interesting, if you have read it, is that you'll notice that he's talking a lot about Jung's concept of the self and what Jung refers to as the persona. So this mask that we put on for others to kind of engage in situations. And that's not always maladaptive, but we all have this constructed view of our identity that we present to other people. And this is the thing that he's really talking about right now. So one of the questions from this that leads us to the next chapter is what happens when life kind of triggers us and our identity or our mask slips? What happens then? As we've said, Geurtz is noting that life and trauma and all the events in your life can actually shift your sense of self, your identity, the mask that you have. And when this happens, the system of rules that you've kind of created for yourself become unstable. And once that's happens, you actually lean into way more rigid rules to gain back control. Okay, so this negative belief then becomes even more dominant. So the more traumatic your events are, the more it reinforces your negative belief, and the more your strategies to get away from the negative belief intensifies. So this feeling that there is just a creation of suffering the whole time. So if a child, for example, sees their parents fighting a lot and they become the peacemaker of the situation, it kind of means that this child will see that only if they're a peacemaker can they try and do something with the situation. But their personality becomes about that then. So when they can't fulfill that role, their mask cracks. And when they do fulfill the role, there's an inherent thing inside themselves that is saying that if they don't do this, conflict will start, and that is their fault. So developmental trauma shows similar patterns here. Disruptions in secure attachments basically lead to this over-reliance on coping strategies. And Geurtz is using this as in a spiritual way, right? He talks about it in terms of karma ripening. So basically that the suffering enforces the cycle to start again. This is where Geurtz really kicks off into this concept of and the idea of stagnation. So like where you can't grow. So if you're getting in these loops and these cycles, where is it, at which part can your growth be stagnated? So Geurtz starts off this chapter, Stagnations and Growth of Consciousness, saying that consciousness naturally wants to grow and expand. That is the core of it. But self-rejection actually blocks it. So once the growth is blocked, it gets diverted. Okay, so you divert your natural want to develop into something else. So possessions or toxic things, like status and all those kinds of things. These are coming from this craving that your consciousness can't naturally grow. So it leans back into basically being redirected to what your self-rejection is actually leaning towards, right? So now once your consciousness gets stuck, what do? You lean back into your survival strategies of what you've learned to cope with your negative beliefs. So, for example, if someone spends most of their life chasing rewards like promotions or things like that, they don't get it or they do get it, they're going to find out in the cycle that it's in psychology, it's called a maladaptive coping. So it's not really what they want. It's to satisfy and get rid of a negative belief, but in chasing something that they think will give them temporary relief, they're in fact reinforcing the actual core negative belief. So it's just, again, going in these cycles. So he's basically saying that, and he refers to a Buddhism concept, which is, I won't even bother pronouncing, but it's avidaya. Sorry. And what this is that it means that not seeing things as they are, rather that your mind creates versions of it, and you basically block your ability to gain awareness or consciousness, and you get stuck in the cycle of suffering. And then he leads into the next chapter, which is the creation of suffering. So here finally at the first part, he makes the connection between suffering and what the identification with the negative belief means. So he's basically saying that events don't actually hurt us. It's not the events, it's the perception of the events that actually hurt us. So if we're viewing, and this is his belief, everything through the lens of I am not okay as I am. So I'm not accepting of who I actually am. And because of that, I have to chase something. So I have to go through every interaction is either going to prove my unworthiness, or if the approval comes, it is a salvation, but only for a small moment, because then we go back into this loop. So for example, he references a breakup, right? So he says the breakup is just the end of a relationship, and it feels like this confirmation of I'll never be enough. So what that means is that you'll take that and you'll find someone who will give you a brief moment of peace of saying, oh, I am enough now. So like the honeymoon phase of a relationship. And then you might break up or have a fight, and then it reconfirms it again. So it's brief moments of the salvation from the cycle of suffering. And he uses this he creates a metaphor for this, and that's chapter 9. So Geurtz in chapter 9 basically explains that love is this free marketplace, okay? And what he says is that we basically trade approval, attention, and validation. So we basically offer parts of ourselves in exchange for love, and we expect return for it. So we will offer something, and we have to get something in return. So we will love someone in order to validate something away from our negative belief. So he's saying that love, in fact, is a transactional model. So, like, for example, if you wash the dishes, you love me or disrespect me. Or if you don't do the dishes, you don't love me. So we add this like a transactional value to each action that we do. And in fact, love is exactly that. In psychology, we call this the social exchange theory. And this is what it means. It means that there are transactional exchanges that are happening between people. But what Buddhist teachings is actually the opposite of this, because Buddhist teachings talk about how true love must be unconditional, because otherwise it will reinforce attachment and clinging. So this brings us to the question of, what does love actually mean? Because he does introduce this concept and start talking about it. But now we actually get to the next chapter, which means all of the things that we've been talking about now. Okay, we're viewing love as transaction. What is love really? What is the love relationship? Keeping in mind that he believes, his model is that everything comes from a craving, a negative self-belief. So Geurtz, the ever optimist, is basically saying that love is a full projection. So we fall for traits in other people where we unconsciously feel like we lack. So for example, if you're an introvert and I'm an extrovert and you fall in love with me, although I'm not an extrovert, but we can hope, you fall in love with me because of these qualities, you believe that it will bring you, it compensates for your lack of extroversion. But you'll soon see that my extroversion will make you feel even worse about yourself. So what that means is that in theory, we may have this ecstasy of falling in love with someone, but it's not real. It's all projections. At least this is what he's saying. So he's talking about how our earliest, in like the honeymoon phase, these early intoxications of love and how we feel about someone is all an illusion. He's saying it's not real, and that everything that we feel about others, the emotion, is basically a projection of ourselves onto others. Now, Jung, again, great in psychology, has a theory on projection when it comes to relationships and how we engage in other people, and that our conversations are projections of it. So yes, we could, once we get to critical evaluation, we can get to it. But what he's basically saying here in the summary of this chapter is that when we believe that we really love someone, is that in fact it is a pure projection of our own lack. Very, optimistic. Now we get to chapter 11, where he talks about where the relationship crisis starts. So he's gearing up towards, which is the crux of what he's saying, addicted to love. So the entire thing of what he's saying here is that when the illusion falters, so basically inevitably the honeymoon phase ends, inevitably the ecstasy we feel someone that we just want to be around them so much ends, the crisis begins. So we stop getting this constant validation from someone, and the insecurity of ourselves, our negative belief, comes right back to us. Now, once that negative belief comes back, all the blame, all the withdrawal, all the attempts of control come out, because now we want to turn this relationship back into the ecstasy part. But he believes the ecstasy part is an illusion. So we are now grappling just with our own projections and our own, awfulness. Our hidden negative beliefs are coming out. So now everything is about negative beliefs. So for example, a fight about chores is rarely about chores. It's about, do you value me? Am I enough for you? So every small little issue starts coming out. And if you think about relationships in his model, that can be true, right? When the honeymoon phase is over, you start bickering a lot. They start to irritate the shit out of you and you don't know why. So your negative beliefs, the things that you really love about them, start to really annoy you, because they bring out what he's saying, your negative belief. The illusion shatters, and it's just your negative beliefs. They make you feel insecure and shitty about yourself, and you make them feel that too, and so you fight. So in psychology, we do have this too. We have this in terms of like attachment theories, but also in like family systems theory, like conflict is usually about unmet needs and so on and so forth. Okay, in Buddhist terms, which there's a kind of a reference to here, is this concept of samsara, which I'm very happy he goes into the next chapter. But the cycle basically of saying that you have the cycle of clinging, loss, and suffering. And he now applies this to love. So basically what he does in this final part of the chapter is he goes, okay, there's a whole chapter, there's a whole structure, the negative belief, layers of identity, your patterns of love, and then the crisis point. And he is basically taking the Buddhist term of samsara and putting it into a psychological model, if you will. Samsara is the Buddhist term, the cycle of suffering. And it basically talks about how our suffering goes on this endless cycle of repetition, right? And that the external solutions we crave to solve our internal worlds actually just create more suffering. So it's just a cycle of suffering. But he's basically saying that unless you gain awareness of the cycle, you can't break the cycle. So there is a lot to unpack here regarding this. So let's dive into that. Okay, let's talk about the negative belief. Harris keeps insisting that we carry this deep unconscious belief that I am not enough and that everything is basically coming to that. And he's building on this in the book, right? We can feel that this is building this concept of the negative belief. But we have to kind of ask ourselves as we're reading this to be critical, not of the writing or the book, but critical of the concept and the model he's saying. Is that really universal? Is what he is saying that this negative belief, is that applied to everyone and everything? Because if we really think about it just psychologically, attachment theory kind of dispels that, because attachment theory shows that there can be people who do grow up in households where they have a stable attachment style because they were reinforced to believe that there's some things that they don't have negative beliefs. They don't have an attachment style that warrants this kind of addiction of love, right? So it's a bit of a tricky one there, because Geurtz, he is kind of overgeneralizing with this concept of that we're all born and we have this inherent negative belief that kind of just is built through all of us. If that is the truth, we're kind of pathologizing normal human behavior, because the normal human need for love and validation is a very normal need. But is the normalness then he's saying that everyone has this negative self-belief, that's what makes it normal? Or is it in fact that wanting closeness is not from some psychological wound, that we are just human beings and that it's biology, social connection? We've got to be critical on that one, because I'm not convinced, and hopefully in part 2 there's more clarity on that. The second thing that we really need to note is where he talks about ego as this fragile mask. So according to him, the ego is nothing more than just a hidden insecurity, that it's purely defensive. But psychology and a lot of other theories see the ego as a very important part of our adaptive ability, right? The ego does a lot for us. It balances our inner drives. It balances that with external demands. It kind of helps us in understanding in relation to other people. Of course, it has projection. Of course, it has all these things. But without ego, we could not function socially. So if we pathologize the ego, we're kind of going to read this book and feel kind of shit about ourselves, because we're going to be like, oh, I do that. And oh, you're now telling me there's no hope because it's just a negative belief and my ego is a bad thing. We can't really be adding so much negativity to ego. That doesn't seem okay. Then the third one that I think we need to really examine here is that Geurtz keeps saying that identifying with thoughts and feelings turns pain into suffering. Now, I fully agree with this, because this is true. When we show an over-identification with an emotion, we actually project ourselves towards that emotion. And that is psychological, that's linguistics, like in your behavior, in your language. If you over-identify with something, it becomes your identity. So, yeah. So, for example, if this is what I love the most about learning different languages. But in Dutch, they have like ik heb dorst, I have thirst. Whereas in English, it's I am thirsty. So even in just, I'm not saying your identification is that you are a thirsty person, although, well, you could be, but there is a distinction between I have an emotion, I have a feeling, I have an identity versus I am a feeling, an emotion, an identity. And that's the core difference, where I do agree that, and this is very the same, this is a very incoherence and parallel to Buddhist teachings and also some psychological teaching, is that the over identification of an emotion, a feeling, is inherently a bad thing. But clinging to the self and this concept that he keeps saying of self-rejection, if we now identify with the concept of we can't accept an identity based on an emotion or whatever, because at the core we're just self-rejecting the whole time, that is also inaccurate. Like, that is also not accurate. So I think that there's a bit of a balancing act that needs to happen here, because we can't accept that self-rejection is the same for everyone, because then we have to first say what is the self, and now we're inherently rejecting the self, which means we are identifying with the rejection, which means we inherently create a division or divide between something. That means that we can't accept what is. So that actually doesn't seem very like a Buddhist theory at this point, not that I'm an expert, but from what I've read, this is not the case. So I'm thinking that he's setting something up. Hopefully in part 2, we can unpack more about this concept. But the fourth one that I think needs and requires some critical review and really critical thoughts of reading is he claims that falling in love is just a projection. Okay. Now, in terms of projections, this is true. We do, in fact, attract people and are attracted to people because everything is a projection of how we view the world. But love cannot be a projection, can it? I'm not going to answer that question because I think that's an important question. Inherently, I disagree with it, but I'm also not sure. Is it or is it not a projection? Because if we fall for qualities in other people that we inherently either admire or like, that would be a projection. But if we go from his model and just being attracted to people with qualities we don't have, that seems like quite a negative way to approach love, right? It seems that kind of cynicism is what philosophers throughout the ages have said is really bad. Cynicism is kind of our demise. I think Aristotle said that. So basically, I might be very wrong on that also. But what I think is most important is that if we do say projection and we do understand that and gain awareness around that, gain consciousness around our projections, we can understand what qualities we love and don't like. But I think, and if we go back to the previous one, is that if we don't over-identify as an emotion, then the over-identification within love would mean that we identify that love is just a self-rejection, just a projection of our own selves. It seems like a weird loop that we're going in right now. So I'm not sure how much I believe in that one, but I think that we can explore and see where it goes in part 2. The other parts that I think we need to explore is the marketplace of love and approval. So now if we understand what love is, okay, if he's saying it's a projection, the other part is that saying now it's just transactional. Okay. I'm not sure how we feel about this one so far, because it does ignore that there are many forms of love that are not transactional. So like unconditional love, what does that mean? Is that unconditional parental love for their child? No matter what they do, they will still love their child. Is that transactional or not transactional? So there's a bit of a blurring here that I'm not sure that we get, because if we do go by the metaphor that love is inherently just transactional and that human being connection is also just transactional, we have to also understand the bigger part of going, are we actually just making human connection now and trivializing it, removing intimacy and thinking it's just economics? It's just something that we need to think about. Finally, Geurtz equates the cycle of self-rejection and love addiction with samsara. Now, samsara I love because it is a concept that I truly enjoy discovering more about, learning about, and I've read many books regarding samsara. And I do see his application. The thing that I think we need to kind of question ourselves as we read this is going, there are self-help books that are very psychologically rooted, and it does shrink it down to single psychological concepts so that it's digestible. But samsara is a big concept, right? And if we just, it feels a bit trivializing of it if we do it. And I think it's important that we do look at it, because samsara is a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Okay, we can of course apply this concept into our relationships. Okay, one thing begins, then it ends, then it begins again, right? But if we really look at that in the sense of love as an addiction and self-rejection, okay, is all love then an addiction? Or is it just certain people who have this self-rejecting viewpoint, they'll choose love that's addictive? So it's not clear yet whether this is a universal thing, that we all have this, or just some people who find that they're addicted to love. And if you are addicted to love, who is addicted to love? Because at this point in time, is my self-rejecting beliefs of maybe I'm not enough leading me towards people who tell me I'm enough and they're not enough? And I might be trivializing this, and then maybe fully explain in part 2. But as part 1, I think we need to ask these questions and explore our own thinking. Yes, be critical about the book, but also figure out what's kind of happening in the book, because at this point in time, not entirely sure. So for now, that's our thoughts on part 1. Part 2 is going to be in 2 weeks' time, and then we meet on the 1st of October in person. If you can't join in person, keep coming online because fun. And all the book notes, a full review of all the concepts we talk about will be in our book club app. And if you want to join, just let me know. There will be a link in the description if you are coming from the outside. Otherwise, I will see you in book club very soon, 1st of October. Very exciting. Enjoy the rest of the book, and I will see you soon.